This happened a few years back when I was 14. It was late March when it was still cold out. My scout troop was doing a campout at one of the 3 reservations that we usually go to. It was a 2-nighter, and the first night and the subsequent day were uneventful. Just the usual group of boys messing around and having a good time. It was the second night when something happened. Like most Boy Scout troops, we play manhunt every chance that we get. I'm sure most of you already know what it is, but I'll go ahead and explain it anyway. Manhunt is basically hide and seek, except played in the dark and usually in the woods. This game, though, had an extra twist, where those who were tagged became hunters themselves. Pretty soon we had it all down to one person. We'll call him Jack. Jack was a couple years older than me and the oldest one in the campout. He was also the second fastest on our cross-country team, so no one could ever catch him. Even me, I'm pretty quick myself. There's no way I could beat Jack out in a sprint. We searched in and around the campsite a number of times, but we just could not find him. That's when we heard him laughing. We traced the laugh to a lone tree in the middle of an open field at the bottom of the hill from our campsite. Sure enough, he was up there, moving nimbly around the branches as he watched us approach. He knew we could not get up there. He could jump really high too and use that skill to grab the lowest hanging branches, which were still too high for many of us to reach. He could just wait us out until we left. So I had an idea. I gathered all the kids in a huddle, and I told them that we're going to pretend to leave, while in reality we would just hide outside his circle of vision, so when he leapt out, we would close this circle and there'd be no way he could escape. They all agreed, and we proceeded to, quote-unquote, leave the area, crouching down in the brush and leaves on the outskirts of the field, waiting for Jack to leave his perch. After a few moments, he must have thought we were gone, so he jumped out. We proceeded to start yelling and sprinting towards him. The circle of kids surrounding him closed with shocking speed. For a split second, he looked afraid, like a deer in the headlights. But I'll be damned if he didn't slip out from between us. With a few quick maneuvers and fake-outs, he was able to slip by a group of the littler kids and fled down the camp road, and then into the woods. Me and the rest of the older kids gave pursuit, yelling at the little ones to stay behind and make sure to tag Jack if he tried to double back down the road. When we got to the part of the road where he jumped off into the woods, we split into pairs. I was with Ben. He was a year younger than me at 13. There were a few other groups that fanned off on either side of the woods, and they were soon lost from view. Ben and I jogged around for a little bit, trying our best to be quiet and keep our flashlights off to avoid being seen by Jack. Anyone who's played manhunt knows that only the most amateur hunters excessively use their lights on the hunt. It wasn't too far into our little search that we began to hear growling. Ben and I looked at each other, a mixture of fear and puzzlement painted over our faces. It was then that I realized that we had wandered into another campsite. I could see the lean-to and the clearing through the trees. The growling was coming from that clearing, and it was getting closer. We could see a shape through the trees crawling towards us. Then we heard a couple of male voices yelling at whatever was growling, but their calls were mostly drunken and dismissive. I heard a scuffling of leaves to my left, and I turned to see Ben sprinting off in the opposite direction. The second he moved, that freaked out the dog and it started pounding towards us at high speeds. I cursed and ran after Ben. We lost track of where we were going swiftly. I was just following Ben's form as the dog crashed through the woods behind us. I soon turned around to see if it was still there, and the second I looked away from where I was going, my leg smashed into a pile of stones. I reacted as quickly as I could, turning my fall into a roll and escaped from that relatively unhurt. As I steadied myself back on my feet, I saw that Ben had stopped and turned to make sure I was okay. I opened my mouth to curse at him for leaving me back there, but he held his finger up to his mouth in a motion for me to shush, whispering this: "We're in an Indian burial ground." To this day, I'm not sure if he was right about that. That part of the woods did look significantly different, however. It was open, there were few trees around, and in their places were rocks. Rocks were scattered all around us and stacked into mysterious large piles every now and then. Even the thing that I had tripped over was one of those piles. They all looked like the cairns that people used to mark hiking trails with. The whole thing was on a hill. It looked like the remains of a landslide. To be honest, there was a strange air about this place. The moon lit up the stones in an eerie, pearly glow, and the breeze and any sounds of the wilderness had ceased. We were surrounded by complete silence. The one you experience when you're in the car alone waiting for your parents. The one where you can hear the slight ringing in your ears. The one that shouldn't exist in the forest, where there's always at least some type of noise at all times, and yet it was completely quiet. And then suddenly the silence was broken when Ben looked up, saw something, and immediately dove behind one of the piles of rocks, pulling me with him. We slid behind the pile of rocks. Ben was breathing heavily and trembling. "What was that for?" I hissed at him angrily, but he shook his head and he pointed his finger around me on the right side of the rock pile. I peeked out from behind our little cover, and what I saw then I will never forget. It was 30 or 40 feet farther up the hill. It was so close and yet shrouded in darkness. It was that kind of dark where you could see, but you also couldn't, if that makes any sense. This thing was tall, 7 or 8 feet. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, with it standing on 2 legs, but it was definitely not human. I've never seen a person that tall, and its arms hung down to its knees, they were so long. And its head. The head was the skull of a deer, glowing in the moonlight like the rocks that surrounded it. Antlers sprouted from the skull and stretched deep into the night sky, bent and gnarled like tree branches. It stood there motionless, staring right at us. Ben and I were under a spell, and we couldn't move. After seemingly an eternity just staring at it, this thing turned and began to run up the hill. The second the skull turned, it was like the spell was broken. In the same instant that it did, I realized I must have been imagining things. Surely it must have been Jack trying to scare us or throw us off. Maybe we just imagined it all because it was so dark and we were so scared. We then assumed that Jack had brought a mask of some kind on the campout to scare us. He often did stuff like that, so we didn't put it past him. I yelled toward Ben, and we began to chase this thing. It was fast. We were both pretty quick, but it was uphill and our feet were sliding down the rocks. But the creature, which at this time we thought was Jack, was bounding up the rocks in long strides. Without even trying, it outran us and cleared the top of the hill. A few seconds later, we burst through the top of the hill as well and back out onto the camp road. But the thing, it was gone. Confused, we headed back down the road towards our campsite. Pretty soon, we found the little kids that we had left behind to catch Jack if he tried to get back to the side on the road. They were surrounding something in a ditch on the side of the road and whispering frantically to one another. We ran over and shoved them aside to find one of our guys lying face down in the ditch. He was trembling so hard, we could see it from the top of the ditch, and he was muttering something too. He was one of the guys who had chased Jack into the woods with us. I jumped down into the ditch and knelt beside him. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer, he just kept shaking and muttering. I was close enough to hear him this time. He was saying, "Is it gone? Is it gone?" over and over again. I put my arm around his shoulder, which caused him to tense up, but when he looked up at me, I saw his eyes clearly, and I knew he knew who I was. And then a second later, he stopped trembling and passed out. Ben and I pulled him out of the ditch, using a fireman's carry to hoist him up and start heading toward the road. The little kids surrounded us with terrified whispers, but we shushed them and told them everything was going to be all right, even as we were terrified ourselves. Later, when this kid woke up, he couldn't remember anything about why he got into that ditch, how long he had been there, or why he was even whispering what he was. He had woke up on the way back to camp. He was calm now, but he was still pale as a sheet. I knew when we got back we would have to take him to the adults. We did, and we told them everything that had happened. Well, just the ditch part. We left out the whole burial ground thing. The adults looked nervous, but a couple of them offered to take the kid to a nearby clinic, just to be doubly sure he was okay. When that was over, we headed back up to our part of the campsite. And that's when we heard laughter coming from one of the tents, the same laughter that was up in the tree. We angrily unzipped the flap to find Jack, who quickly stopped laughing when he saw how mad we were. We dragged him out of the tent and began to yell at him, saying how he scared us in the burial ground and scared one kid so bad he had passed out. We demanded he show us this stupid mask of his so we could burn it. His look was one of complete confusion. He told us the second he broke free from that circle, he ran into the woods, doubled back, went around the little kids that were guarding the woods, and hid in one of the tents until we came back. In other words, he was here the whole time. I didn't want to believe him, but that look in his eyes told me and everyone else he was sincere. Ben and I looked at each other. Whatever we had chased in that burial ground was definitely not Jack. We told everyone in the troop about it. A bunch of us, including Jack, even went back in the morning to check it out. But there was nothing there except the piles of stones. So all I have to say is I'm so thankful that whatever that thing in the woods was, decided to run away, rather than anything else it could have done to us. Weird, deer skull, long arm, tall creep. Let's not meet again. The experience I'm about to share with you needs some background information first. I was 14 at the time of this experience and had been living with my mother all my life. It was always just me and her. My life was pretty normal compared to other 14-year-old guys. I mean, I loved sports. I was a freak about the outdoors and would go camping with friends almost every month. We loved these camping trips. They were a time when just a group of boys could hang out and do whatever they wanted. But this particular camping trip changed the outdoors for me forever. My dad had actually agreed to drop me off with the 3 other guys in a place called Goopergondra. It was a river that ran through the Australian bush. When my dad dropped me off, he said he would be back in a few days, which usually meant 4 days knowing my dad, but we had no problems with that. We all set off on what was supposed to be an hour-long hike, but it ended up just being a 3-hour-long party through the bush. We were having a great time. My friend Aiden even played some songs through his pocket speakers. We reached our usual camping ground at 4 p.m. and we started unpacking our gear. We had our tents up by 4:30, so with so much daylight left, we decided to go for a swim in the river. It was right next to our camp anyway. It was around 6 at night before we had decided to dry off and get a fire going. But it wasn't until 10 that night that we began to hear strange noises. They sounded like an animal in pain. We tried our best to ignore it. I mean, out here it could have just been an animal who had been bitten by a snake or something. Eventually, the noises stopped for a bit, until around 11, when we heard a howl. If I had to guess, it sounded like it came a kilometer off. "What the hell was that?" my friend James asked. I don't know," Aiden replied. Riley, who was the most mature of us all, said, "Guys, come on, surely it can't be nothing more than a wild dog." We thought for a moment and agreed. I replied, "Yeah, you're probably right." We finally decided to head into our tents around 12, and everybody went to sleep rather quickly. The next few nights were fine. Nobody heard any strange noises, although I had the constant feeling I was being watched. It was the 4th night when things went down. At around 10, I saw a dark figure run across the bank of the river. It honestly scared me, but I continued this game of denial and brushed it off as a wild dog. But I did ask everyone else if they had seen it, but they said they saw nothing. For the next few hours that day, I kept glancing over to the spot that I saw that thing disappear into. And again, it wasn't until 12 that night that I saw eyes. Oh, the eyes were like nothing I've ever seen. They were bright, glowing yellow, and they were staring right at me. I told everyone to look over at the eyes, and they were all as shocked as I was. Aiden, who was the oldest, had his shotgun. He stood up and fired a warning shot at the thing, but it didn't even move. It didn't flinch at all. Aiden got a very worried look on his face, in being overconfident, wanting to be seen as the alpha among us. He aimed and took another shot at this creature. This time we all saw it hit the thing. It let out a strangled howl and took one giant step towards us, and for the first time, we could see this creature out in the open. It was bigger than I thought it was. It must have easily been 4 feet tall. It had a head like a wolf or dog, but had a shorter snout. It had no hair except for some on its head. Its ears were long and pointed, and it was bearing long fangs at us. Its arms were so long and gangly, but its back legs seemed powerful and muscular. We just stared at this thing until it took another step towards us. Then it did the unimaginable. I swear to God, this thing stood up. It then let out another howl, and we ran. With me in front, we sprinted through the bush until we made it to a park ranger's cabin, which was the exact place my dad had dropped us off earlier. Luckily, someone was there. The ranger that was on duty asked what was wrong. We all replied together, trembling and cowering in fear. "There's something back there, something in the bush." Of course, though, the ranger saw nothing, heard nothing, and found nothing. And thus, this story ends with us not knowing what we saw that night, but we all definitely saw something. It was a creature none of us had ever seen before. I swear every word to be true. And if anyone knows what we saw and has a similar experience, we beckon you to share it with us. One of my friends and I were at my mom's house in Tasmania, Australia. Let's call him Jimmy. My parents recently divorced, so she lived in a small rental house next to a park. We decided to go to the park by jumping the fence instead of walking along the trail. We were lazy 11-year-olds used to playing video games after all. After we jumped the fence, we just walked around kicking a soccer ball. Nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until this guy standing behind a willow tree watched us. We pretended we didn't notice him for about 15 minutes, until we started getting weird feelings that he was some sort of creeper or pedophile. We walked back to the fence that had a hedge surrounding it. It had a plank of wood on one side to help us jump over. So we jumped over and walked back to my mom's house. And when I turned back to the fence, he was standing just on the other side of it, looking at us. He ducked once he saw me looking at him. We told my mom what had happened, and she told us not to go back. So we decided to play some video games until he went home. A couple of weeks go by and a different friend of mine comes over. He says we should go over to the park and hang out. I had nothing better to do, so I went. We were just riding around on some longboards, sometimes sitting down and talking and sometimes standing. And then we both start to hear some music that sounds like it's near us, but it wasn't because we were in the middle of the park. It echoed in our heads for a minute until we decided to run back to my mom's house and stay there. We did a full sprint back to the fence and threw my longboards over and then climbed up the plank and jumped. We heard the music for another hour or so, getting quiet slowly until it was gone. Then after dinner my friend left, and nothing strange happened afterwards. A month or so later I was there with Jimmy and his sister. We were sitting around hanging at the park on the swings and running around playing tag, until finally we decided to go play basketball. We were playing for about an hour or so until the same music started playing. This time we decided to ignore it, even though it was really creepy, and continue to play basketball. Around 10 minutes later, my friend notices the same old guy from before, sitting by the same willow tree watching us play basketball. He told me and we explained to his sister that this old guy has watched us before, and I told him that I had recognized this music. We continued to ignore everything until we noticed the old guy was gone. Me and Jimmy looked around seeing where he was. And then we saw that he was at the plank that we usually left from. We waited about another hour. The music went down by now, but the guy still had not left, and it was creeping us out a lot. It was almost time to leave at about 5:45 when he still did not move. So we decided to go to my dad's house, which was just up the street in the other direction. We started walking, and so did this old man. We sped up because he was getting too close. He was jogging up to us, and we were still about a block away from my dad's house. So we just took off in a run. I looked back, and so did Jimmy, and we saw this man running too, chasing after us. When we were on my lawn, my dad was out front smoking. He saw us, and the old guy stopped and casually walked up the street. We started to explain what happened, and he was glad that we made it back. After about an hour of being there, he said he would drive us to my mom's house, and we stayed there until around 8, when Jimmy and his sister were dropped back off at their house. All of us are still creeped out by this, and it has even been 6 years. I haven't gone back to that park since, and my mom has moved into an actual house, but we still drive past it often, and it gives me chills every time. But just last year when we drove by, I saw that same man in the same willow tree watching some other children on the jungle gym playing around. If anything, just take this as a warning to you all. Be careful where your kids are going. One day they may not come back. So stay safe and don't let your kids out before telling them how to react in these situations. This had to be the most horrific thing I've ever experienced in my life. This wasn't even too long ago, but I want to share my story with you people out there so you can think twice before you approach the sketchy new kid at school. Here we go, I guess. It was my first day back at school, and I was excited. I was excited to see my friend. Let's call her Kim. She went overseas for the holidays, so I didn't get to see her for a month. We met up and got talking. Luckily, it seemed like we had most of our classes together. We decided to go to first period early because we had our favorite teacher for English, so we thought it would be nice to talk with her. When we entered the room, she was not there, so we just thought she went out to get something. But what we did see was a kid we did not recognize, sitting in the corner of the room, looking down at his hands. Kim said she had an uneasy vibe from him, but I just ignored her and approached him. "Hi," I said as chirpy as I could. He slowly lifted his head up and stared at me with just a blank face. No emotions. At that moment, I finally knew what Kim was talking about. He just sat there staring at me. He didn't say anything, just stared into my soul. I started to feel uneasy, but I could not just say hi then leave. That would be rude. "Hello," he finally replied. I nervously smiled at him. He didn't look back down to whatever he was looking at earlier. He just kept staring right into my eyes. "Tosh," Kim calls for me. I turn around and look at Kim, who looks so uncomfortable. I was relieved she called out my name. I nodded to her and turned my head to face this new kid. "Well, it was nice meeting you." "Yeah, right." I walked back to Kim and pulled her with me to the other side of the room. Kim and I talked for a while, but I could not stop peeking over her shoulder to see that new kid still staring at me. It was just plain creepy, but hey, what could I do about it? Kim had to come home with me after school. My mom picked us up and dropped us at my house because my mom and brother needed to go straight to a birthday party, so it was just going to be me and Kim home alone. I've never been the best at staying home alone, especially when it's at night. Kim and I were in the living room watching all of the romance movies I had on the TV. In the middle of watching The Longest Ride, we heard a knock at the door. It was pouring rain out there, so it was unusual that someone just came knocking up at our front doorstep. And it couldn't have been my mom. She would have used the garage door to get in. I looked over at Kim, and she just looked at me confused. Who the hell could that be? Kim looked scared at this point. Now, Kim and I get scared easily. I walked up to my front door and looked back to Kim nervously. We heard another knock at the door, but it was louder. I jumped back and stared at the door in horror. Kim ran up to me and we both stood together staring at the door. Then my phone began to ring. I covered my mouth, scared from the sound, and grabbed my phone straight away. It had no caller ID. I stared at it for a moment and then finally answered it. "Hello?" What the person from the other side of the phone said next absolutely terrified me. "Why won't you open the door?" I looked up at the door in fear, and then I just grabbed Kim's arm and pulled her up the stairs into my room. What the hell? She was so confused but also scared, and I was absolutely horrified. I attempted to dial 000, but my hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold on to my phone. Who was on the other line? I looked up to her in pure terror. I don't know. I finally dialed 000 and then held the phone to my ear, and every second I had to wait felt like hours. I told the lady on the phone that there was someone banging on the door and they somehow had my number. The lady said to wait where we were and that someone was on their way, and she suggested we stay on the phone with her. But only a few minutes later on the phone, my phone died, and that's when we heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I ran to my charger and plugged my phone in. I desperately tried to switch it on, and eventually it did. Kim was sitting in the corner of the room crying her eyes out, and I knew I had to do something. When my phone switched back on, I saw 2 missed calls from a no-caller ID. I did not hesitate to call this person back. I pressed the call button, and I waited. And when they picked up, I said this: "Listen, I don't know who you are and what you want, but you better freaking leave." I was furious and terrified at the same time, but I had to be strong and tell them to back off. But all I heard from the other side was heavy breathing, like panting. "Listen to me." It was the boy from school. I knew it. I was completely confused. "I need you to climb out of your window." He sounded out of breath. I ran to my window and looked down to see a dark figure looking up at me. Is that you?" He sounded kind of scared. "Yeah," I whispered. Then all of a sudden I heard a bang on my bedroom door. Kim tried to shut herself up, but it was no use. She was crying out loud. "I know you're in there." She had the creepiest voice ever. She sounded absolutely insane. So I turned back to the window, opened it. I then forced Kim outside. When she was out, I jumped out and onto the roof. Kim jumped down, and then I followed. and when I did, I could clearly see it was the boy from school. When I turned around, I saw a blonde girl stumble her way out of what was once a door. She started hysterically shouting at specifically me, saying that Nick was hers and how she was going to kill me if ever talked to him again. I didn't know what this psycho was babbling about, but I was mostly worried about the kitchen knife she was holding in her hand. The boy started screaming at her, telling her that she's a complete nutjob and that he doesn't love her like how he used to. Then we heard the sirens of police cars get louder and louder each second. This did not alert the girl at all. She just kept hysterically screaming at the boy and then pointing at me occasionally. A police car pulled up on my driveway, and a police officer came rushing out, screaming at the girl to drop her weapon and to put her hands above her head. Eventually, she complied, and the officer arrested her. But the thing I will not forget is what she said to me before she was shoved into the back of that police car. "Once I'm free, I am coming for you." Along with this bizarre and terrifying experience that just came out of nowhere, those words will haunt me for the rest of my life. After the police left, the boy explained to us that the girl was his ex-girlfriend, which he had broken up with her because he found out she was doing drugs. But she was so madly in love with him and insane, she told him she would find him no matter where he goes. He thought she was just joking, but he found out the hard way that she was not. He moved here and tried to lay low, but somehow she found out about how I had talked to him at school, and she went absolutely nuts. After that night, Nick and I became pretty close friends. This incident happened about 3 months ago, and on my birthday, Nick asked me to be his girlfriend. I said yes, but this made me even more afraid, because once that girl does get out, I'm scared that she will find me, and she will attempt to kill me again. This took place when I was around 12 or 13. Me, my brother, and my dad were hunting in a state park in Tennessee. We had permission to hunt there because there was an overpopulation of coons in the area. We had been hunting for around 3 or 4 hours before what I'm about to tell you took place. It had just rained, so any scents would be refreshed and would be easily trackable for the dogs. It was a cloudy night, but the moon would poke out here and there. Now, my dad was in the U.S. Army for about 22 years, and he had done a tour in Afghanistan, so he wasn't scared of much, and he knew what to do in sketchy situations. Anyway, we had just set the dogs loose and turned off our light. We waited for the dogs to start barking on a scent, and soon after, the dogs must have picked up the scent of raccoons. We listened as they followed the trail, when suddenly, they abruptly stopped. Luckily, we had a Garmin tracking device on us that tracked our dogs. This is how the tracking system works. The dogs wore collars that send out signals back to the tracker. The tracker has a screen with the mapped-out terrain of the surrounding area, with the icons on the screen showing where the dogs were. We were glued to the screen, wondering what caused them to stop barking. As we were watching, I noticed that it had become quiet. No dogs barking, no bug sounds, no frog sounds, no nothing. Just silence. After about 15 or 20 minutes, my dad said we had to go in and get them, because there was a chance they could have chased a raccoon into an armadillo hole, so their barks would be muffled. We started walking towards the dog's location. It was about a half-mile hike over steep hills and swamps. We got about 60 yards from where the dogs were meant to be, when we heard what sounded like a train blowing through the woods away from us. Slowly, it faded away. Hesitantly, I looked at the tracker and saw that my dog's tracker stopped working. My dad loaded his 12-gauge semi-auto shotgun and told us to stay close. I was carrying a .22 caliber rifle, and my dad told me to stay in the back, while he stayed in the front with my little brother in the middle, who was very scared at this point. I loaded my small 9-round magazine and stayed close to my dad. Eventually, we got to where the other dog tracker was, and we looked down on her bloody body. My dad and I looked at each other, and we both had the "we need to get out of here right now" look on our faces. I nodded and took guard while my dad took off the tracker of the dog. He had it off almost immediately, and we were backtracking our way to the truck. After about 20 minutes going up and down hills and going through deep swamps, we got back to the truck, and we jumped right in. When we got back to the main road and stopped and looked back at the tracker, we saw that my dog's tracker would pick up and then disappear. After a while, the batteries in the tracker became too weak, and the signal stopped. After that, I never went hunting at night again. Neither did my brother or dad. I don't know what killed our dogs, but whatever it was big, and it tore through the brush and trees quickly, like it wasn't a problem for it to go through. I still have that memory always on the back of my mind, and I think I always will, because neither in the forest, nor on mine or on TV, have I ever heard an animal that sounded like that thing that night. This did not happen to me, but to my father, my sister, and my brother. This is how it was told to me years later. Me, my sister, and my father are all pretty sensitive when it comes to paranormal things, so this is by far their scariest experience. They still get shaky talking about it, and even thinking about it. This was the only instance of that demon in our house. That house was very haunted, and everyone except my mother felt and saw things there. So, without further ado, this is the story from my father. It was very late at night, between 2 and 4 a.m., when my dad came out of his room and went to get some water. As he made his way to the kitchen, he saw my older sister sitting on the couch and staring into the corner of the ceiling. He asked her, "Well, what's wrong, Squirt?" And as he looked up to where she was staring, he went completely cold. For there, in the ceiling corner, there were 2 piercing red eyes. My father very slowly made his way onto the couch and sat beside my sister, holding her close. They stared directly into its eyes and never broke contact. After a solid 5 to 10 minutes of this staring contest, the eyes slowly made their way along the ceiling, just barely above them. As it made its way from the living room into the hallway, my older brother walked into the front door and made his way up the stairs when he noticed my father and sister sitting and staring. So of course he followed their line of sight, and he froze as well. As he stood at the top of the stairs, he followed the eyes down the hallway, just like my father and sister were doing. They made their way past my brother and my room, past the bathroom, past my parents' room, and finally into my sister's room. They slowly moved down from the ceiling to the floor and sank down. It looked as if whatever it was sitting down in my sister's doorway. Needless to say, none of them were able to move from their spots for a while, and no one slept that night. When I was little, I would wake up at night, and I would feel the need to look at the front doorway, where I would always see a short shadow person. Just for some background information, when entering the house, the front door had 2 half windows, one on each side of the door, and the door itself was one of those old solid ones that was separated into 3 that had 2 long parallel dips running lengthways the bottom of the door, and a window in the recess at the top. When you entered the house, the bedroom I shared with my sister was the first door you would walk past. It was originally the lounge room. Then walking about 3 feet down the hallway, there is an alcove with my parents' bedroom on the same side as my shared bedroom. The bathroom is in the middle. Anyway, I was about 4 when I began to see this shadow, and it just suddenly stopped the summer before 6th grade. At least it did for me. That was when I swapped rooms with my baby sister. So I would wake up at night, and I would feel someone watching me sleep. I would look towards the door, which was left open to let in the light from the street. That way we could see when we went to the bathroom. So I'd wake up, and I'd see this shadow person standing in the doorway. I can remember not feeling scared or anything. The shadow itself was about 5'2" and was wearing one of those boater hats. You know, those flat-top straw hats. Being as little as I was, I would liken it to the Hamburglar from McDonald's. I would watch it for a few minutes, and then turn over and go back to bed. It's not too scary, I know, but when I was older and had swapped rooms with my baby sister, I couldn't sleep with that door open at all. Like there was something watching me, something that did not like me. It wasn't until years later, I was about 19, that we were talking about ghost stories, and I came out and told my sisters about the shadow person in my doorway. And creepy enough, my sisters came out as well, and they told me that they had seen the exact same shadow. The house was built by my great-grandfather after he returned from World War I. He had owned that block as well as the blocks either side. The house is only 90 or so years old and has been in my family that entire time. So I honestly don't know who or what we could be seeing.